So hello, and in today's video it's a little bit of a different one. I usually do the top 10s around creatures or whatnot, and I thought today, what do the beginners need? And I think they need some top tips. So I'm going to give you 5 tips if you're a struggling Ark player, which I think you should follow, and you'll get up to the top in no time. Tip number 5 is housing, and getting a base and sort of settling an area in the early game, in my opinion, is going to be really important for you. Building a thatch hut isn't too much to ask for, and you can keep the stuff there, get a bed down. That means if you do die, there's a lot that you can do to recoup yourself, because inevitably that is going to happen. But if you can negate what you lose when you die, it really can help to have a base, have some equipment, and just some general stuff there. Plan it out, and most certainly a lot of beds for those respawn points, because there's nothing worse than dying, realizing you don't have a bed and just spawning in the middle of nowhere, and then dying on your way back to base, or just not even having a base in the early game. It can really drive you in the wrong direction. So I strongly recommend, even if it is a couple of thatch foundations and maybe a few walls, or just a thatch foundation and a bed and a storage box, get something down so you can start using that, and it is really going to help you progress further. Of course, you can expand it over time. In number 4, we've got explorer notes, and this is one which I really want to put here, because if you're particularly struggling with leveling up, look up where the explorer notes are, or maybe go for a wander yourself. Although if you're new to the game, I'd recommend looking it up, but some of them are relatively easy to find. They're usually around notable things, and you can tell where they are because they've got these sort of structures around them. Once you know sort of where to look for them and just generally to look out for them, your leveling will progress a lot, because you get tons of XP from this. You can also use this to level up your creatures as well, which is beneficial if you're preparing for boss fights, although by that time you might have now doors them up, but there might be a few which you haven't. You can always check your achievements to check if you've got them. I know that might only be, if you got 100% of them in the past, it might show up as you still got all of them, but it's a useful way to know if you've got all the explorer notes yet. And you can always look on the map and go around, see which ones you haven't got and see which ones you have got, and you can always move to different maps as well to get even more. But particularly if you're starting out, find some explorer note locations, pick a spawn point where there are loads nearby, and go for it and see how many explorer notes you can get, because it's going to boost your level. Even if you die in between runs, I would recommend doing this before you start building a base. Then you get your levels up, get your stats up a bit, and then you've got loads of tools at your arsenal to make once you do find somewhere to settle. Number 3 is getting your weapon game together. Things like spears are incredibly useful in the early game. Pikes and swords and obviously guns of any sort are off the table for beginners, but even the simple spear, or maybe slingshot for knocking stuff out, but the spear is really where it's at. The club can sort of be useful at times as well, but I'm mainly focusing on spears here. Get yourself some spears, and of course the bow as well. It's going to give you some long range combat, and it will help you out with creatures, and it ties in quite nicely to the thing which is next up. But if you're screaming at the screen knowing what I'm going to say, keep that and see if what you're thinking I'm going to say is actually what I say. But for the time being, spears and bows, get yourself some of those. Get yourself as many arrows as you can, 100 at all times. Really, they're not too expensive to make. If you're playing on default rates, that might be a little bit of trouble for you, and a little bit less, but as many arrows as you can. Get yourself a bow and get yourself some spears, and quite a lot of them, because they will break. But keep some in your base as well, because they are reasonably heavy. Same for the arrows, you should always have some spares. But if you do die, you can get yourself some weaponry. Some armor is also useful, as a little side note, as that is not on my list, but it gets a little mention here. Get yourself armor as soon as possible. Pretty self-explanatory, but it goes well with the weapons. In number 2, we have got bowlers, and this is just something which I think it deserves its own. Now, I was considering putting parachutes on here, but I think bowlers are far more useful to you beginners out there, because if you've got raptors chasing after you, or maybe in a PvP situation, if you're somehow finding yourself in that scenario, you could bowler a player as well. But I'm mainly thinking for raptors and smaller pests that you're going to find around. it can get you out of a lot of trouble. And if you want to be taming your first pteranodon and getting up in the air, a bowler and a club is probably what you're going to be using. So the bowler is incredibly useful, and it still is right the way through the game. But if you have not got yourself a bowler yet and you are a beginner, please get them now. And if you're not a high enough level yet, do the explorer note tip like I said earlier, because that is going to get you the necessary XP required to allow you to get those bowlers. I really think they're useful, and I think you should get one immediately because it is hindering your playing not having them. And finally, it's pretty self-explanatory for a dinosaur game, but tame stuff. Just tame as many things as you can. Now, obviously taming the dodos, the lystros, the dilos, whatever, can be nice, but if you're looking up to some bigger creatures like maybe a raptor or a trike or a carbenemes or a stego or anything like that, tame stuff, or just tame those things. But even taming stuff is useful in just learning and progressing on how all the tames work, because you've got knockout tames, passive tames, and special tames on top of that as well. But you should mainly be focusing on the passive and knockout tames. Get yourself used to it. Bowlers are going to come in handy if you do want to tame yourself raptors or pteranodons. Get useful to how the knockout method works. Either use a club, a slingshot, or some trank arrows on a bow. Depending on where you are, you probably won't be in the trank dart range yet, but if you do manage to find yourself across those, then of course don't use those for your taming. But in my opinion, just taming stuff is probably the best thing you can do. It may be a struggle, but just get out there, try and tame some things, and you know, try and tame some bigger things. You might think they're a little bit out of your field, but you know, you can always make some traps. At some point I will be doing a trap guide, and if you're interested in that, comment down below, because there will be one coming soon, but it will come even sooner if you comment it down below, maybe within the next couple of days. Have you ever wondered that when you started Ark, if you knew a little bit more, would your experience have been a little bit better? Well, in today's video, I'm giving you 10 things that I wish I knew when I started playing Ark Survival Evolved, because there's a lot. In at the number 10 spot, we have got Narco berries. And what I mean by this is you can use Narco berries to keep creatures asleep. I didn't know about Narco berries or narcotics. The only thing that I really knew is you punch a dinosaur and you knock it out, and then you chuck whatever berries in it, and then boom, see if it tames. And I was really wondering about this torpor thing, and I noticed by punching it, the torpor went back up. But, you know, I didn't know anything about taming effectiveness back then. It's not great for taming effectiveness at all, and Narco berries are a quick, dirty, and easy way, obviously, to get all of that nitty-gritty done. With the torpor, you can just get it back up without losing any taming effectiveness. Really, you will lose some of it, because obviously with further consumption, you'll lose a little bit, but it's so negligible. It is totally fine to use those Narco berries. If you've got narcotics, that's great, but I didn't know about those either. Now, continuing on with the berries, stimberries. And often I would run out of stamina in the most crucial moments. I'm sure it's all happened to us. There's a raptor chasing after us and we're running away from them, and we just run out of stamina and die. Well, if you keep stimberries in your hotbar, you can nom down on those, and then you can keep your stamina up. Yes, your water will go down, but in a very serious situation, it really does work effectively. And if I knew about that, I could have saved myself a heck of a lot of deaths when I started playing the game. Namely to raptors, because they are really, really annoying on the island when you're just going around the beaches, and there's some raptors. Metal ore. This one sounds a little bit weird, maybe, but I didn't know what metal ore was when I started playing the game. So I just mined loads and loads of rocks with my stone pickaxe until I got metal, and that's how I thought you did it. And it just took me hours and hours and hours to get anything done with metal tools. Then I discovered metal ore, and I just realized absolutely how stupid I've been. But, you know, to my credit, they're usually up in the mountains, and I was up in the north where I started. I think I started North Zone 2 on the island, so it was a little bit out of the way, but still, I could have also done river rocks as well. That's another thing I didn't know about. But any kind of different rock apart from stone. But metal ore especially, if I knew about that, that would have saved me a lot of time in the early days when I just thought, oh, the only way to get metal is just by mining these rocks. I didn't even think to look it up. In number 7, I've got an interesting one, but I'm sure most of us did it when we were at the start of the game. If you know survival games, and obviously Ark's a survival game, survival sandbox game, you can't drink seawater in most survival games. You have to purify it on any kind of fire. You have to boil the water and get it out. Raft is a great example. Here's a clip of just some water being distilled. I think that's the word for it in Raft. You don't have to do that in Ark, and I did not know that. So I spent ages looking for little pockets of water, and there are a few. There's one in that sort of, I can't remember what it's called. I always call it the compound because Ballistic Squid called it that. There's one up in the north section. It'll be on screen, and there's another one as well. I'll point arrows to both. I spent ages looking for those, and I did not realize that you could literally just drink the seawater. It doesn't make much sense, but you can do it, and I really wish I knew that when I was playing the game for the first time. Passive taming. Now, I knew about knockout tames because I've seen a few things on Ark, especially. I started to watch Ballistic Squid series as well because I was like, I'm playing this game. Why not watch his series? If you haven't watched it either, it is a really great one. There are 50 episodes to binge through, and it is truly a great series. I will leave a link to that in the description below if I actually remember to do that. But yes, I really did not know about passive taming at all. I would just knock out creatures, and when the Ichthyosaurus came out, I had no idea how to tame it, and I spent hours just knocking them out and wondering, why can't I put stuff in this? Like, why can't I feed this? And then I learned about passive tames and how passive taming works. And, you know, now it's second nature, but back then, especially when passive tames were they weren't common, to say the least. I think the Ichthyosaurus was the first one to introduce it. It really, really did help to know what passive tames were, because I just knew knockout tames. You just knock something out, and I'm sure that's what most of us would be thinking, and, you know, I followed a similar trail of thought. Beaver dams. I know it was a little bit later, but still, I really, really, really just hated gathering cementing paste, and I was like, there must be a better way to gather this, and I didn't even bother to look it up. I just kept playing the game as normal and getting loads of stone and loads of chitin or keratin in a mortar and pestle. Took ages to craft, and then obviously when the Casteroides came out, I still did nothing. And then I learned about beaver dams and all the cementing paste in beaver dams. You can also get rare flowers, rare mushrooms, and tons of wood if you want that too. Although usually I don't get the wood, I just drop it out of my inventory because most times you'll get quite encumbered. But yeah, getting cementing paste from beaver dams is so much easier than the traditional method of literally just stone, chitin, keratin. That used to be the only way that you could do it, as far as I'm concerned, in the mortar and pestle. But when the Casteroides happened, then there was a much better way to do things, and I really just had an absolute brain melt moment when I learned this. Now, another thing that I didn't learn in at number 4 spot is knockouts can be done with a club. Okay, I just used my fists and the slingshot. I didn't know that the club would knock things out, and I think that makes me look a little bit stupid, and I'll admit that too, because surely a club, you hit something over the head with a club, it gets knocked out. But I was just using slingshots, and, you know, the slingshot's fine and it works effectively if you're taming things like cub enemies in the early game, but if you want to tame like pteranodons or parasaurs, a club is a much better option. But obviously you can go up to trancaros. It wasn't maybe the biggest thing, but it makes a big difference in the early stages of the game if you've got a club to knock things out. So that's why I put it so high on the list, and I really think if I knew about this sooner, I would have got a lot more taming done in my early days. Dino food preferences is in at the number 3 spot. And, you know, you just assume if it's a carnivore, it eats meat, and if it's a herbivore, it eats berries. I knew nothing about, you know, the way that the food worked and dino food preferences. There will always be kibble, but if you don't have access to kibble, that's fine. Carnivores will generally prefer mutton, and that is the way that I usually go. I'm pretty sure the Thyla prefers cooked food. I hope I'm getting that right. I'll put something on screen if I got that terribly wrong. That would be slightly embarrassing since I played Ark for so long. But yeah, and then for berries, you just chuck whatever berries you want in. I didn't know that Megio berries were the preferable one. And then obviously you can grow your own vegetables, and then from that get even better food for those herbivores. But Megio berries, I didn't know that they were the best. I just chucked like Tinto berries, and I just chucked all of them in, really. That doesn't make too much difference if you chuck all of them in, but it makes you look like you know what you're doing, and you actually do know what you're doing if you just chuck in the Megio berries, and the tames are going to go faster. Then raw meat generally is what you'll be using in the early days for carnivores. That doesn't matter too much, but if you've got prime meat, chuck that in there. And if you've got mutton, even better. When I got to do bosses, I really didn't know what boss dinos to use. And I just went around taming loads of things, and I all brought them in, and I just had a mix and match of all kinds of creatures. And I think I could have used a much better strategy, especially if I knew what the best boss dinos were. We are going back a little bit, so there wasn't as much variety, but still, I probably could have stuck to Rexes or Spinos or Megatheriums and had no trouble, whatever. Especially for the Broodmother, which was the first boss that I ever did. If I knew about all of that, it would have made that less time-consuming for me, because I didn't know how strong the boss would be, and I didn't know what creatures would be good to defeat the boss. So I just assumed, just tame loads of things and see what works. I guess I had Carnos, I had Rexes, I had Dimorphs, I had a few Megatheriums, I had some Phiomias, just loads of stuff that I just chucked in, which was completely unnecessary. And if I knew about what the best boss dinos were, I would have saved myself quite a lot of headache. And in number one, it is bowlers, because bowlers are just an amazing thing, and I didn't know what they did. I didn't even bother to craft a bowler. I was so stupid when I started playing the game. I just didn't even know what it was. Didn't even bother crafting it. Didn't even bother unlocking it. I just was so determined to get the bow and arrow. That was my focus. So I completely skipped it, and taming things like pteranodons or parasaurs even is an absolute headache without a bowler. And I made a video like way back on just 5 beginner mistakes, and one of them was not using a bowler, and I still stand to this. Please get yourself bowlers as soon as possible, and it is the number one thing that I wish I knew as a beginner player when coming to Ark. They are so useful, especially for pteranodons, which are a big step for a beginner. It's going to be your first flying tame, and even a parasaur, your simple berry gatherer, is going to be far easier to tame. Any creature that you can bowler will be far easier to tame than if you did not use a bowler, unless it's just an insanely slow thing. It's still, you don't have to move as much. Anyway, that is all that I have time for today, and all 10 things. If you didn't agree with my list, comment your 10 down below. This video was also up 24 hours early on the Patreon as well, so if you want to go support me on Patreon, get some early videos. There'll also be a new Ark Let's Play series coming out over the next few weeks on there for the 2 higher tiers. So if you really do want to become a Patreon member and support me, then please do. You're going to get more content like this. You get full uncut versions of the videos, and I think you'll really like it over there. But anyway, that's all I've got for today. And give it up for our patrons, Ekaterina Puchkova and Karina Thorne, Dominic Macy-Jewski, sorry about that name, and everyone else that's on this list. All the people I've mentioned are paid members, and if you feel like that's something you want a shout out at the end of the video, go join the Patreon or become a paid YouTube member.